If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel. I am back with yet another album rankings, discography ranking, whatever, and this is going to be a big one, not only because of the band we're talking about, but also the amount of albums and the stories we're going to be talking about here. So this is going to be one of the longer discography ranking videos that I've done, probably second behind Black Sabbath, I'm going to guess. But today I am talking about all 18 studio albums from heavy metal gods Judas Priest. This has been a discography I've wanted to talk about for a long time because, well, as a lot of metalheads will say, there are four very important metal bands that people who are just getting into heavy metal have to check out first. Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Metallica, and Judas Priest. So, yeah, the big four of heavy metal right there, I would say. Sabbath, Priest, Maiden, Metallica. So, we are now doing the fourth of those bands. We've already talked Metallica, we've talked Sabbath, we've talked Maiden, now we're talking Priest. So, Judas Priest, how I got into Judas Priest, well, this kind of goes back to when I was a kid. It was through a couple different things. Classic rock radio with my family, of course. And then, of course, I would say Guitar Hero was kind of a big gateway for me getting into Judas Priest, because I would play, like, You Got Another Thing Coming, Electric Eye, and even Rock Band having Painkiller, and just immediately falling in love with Priest, and then going back through some of the albums and loving what I heard. And then even going back to some of the deep cut albums doing this ranking was very interesting, and I enjoyed it for the most part. But there will be a couple of albums we'll get to later on that will kind of sway me a little bit to one side to some extent. But you never know. It can be a bit of a thing. Now, I'm actually looking at two different monitors for this because to kind of keep things on track, I got the recording on this monitor, the album info, and on my little TV here, my list. So if you see me looking everywhere and wondering, oh, what are you doing? That's why, just to give you a heads up. But without further ado, with all that said about how I got into Judas Priest, let's get into the history of this band. So Judas Priest formed in 1969 under the name Fright, or Freight. Actually, I think it's Freight. Like freight train, not fright. Fucking stupid. But anyways, so Freight, they were originally known in 1969, and then in 1970, they would change their name to Judas Priest. The original lineup consisted of Ian Hill on bass, K.K. Downing on guitar, Al Adkins on vocals, and John Ellis on drums. And they were mostly playing like small club shows back during this time frame. And this lineup would last from 1969 until 1971, where in 1971 John Ellis would leave the band and in would come drummer Alan Moore. And this lineup would last from 1971 to 1972. And in 1972, Alan Moore would leave the band for a while, and Chris Campbell would come in to take over on drums. And this lineup would last from 1972 to 1973, because in 1973, we had a bit of a radical transformation happen. Well, 1973 and 1974. 1973, both Al Adkins and Chris Campbell would leave the band. According to Al, he didn't think the band was actually going to make it. And that's why he left the band in 1973, and Chris Campbell would leave, and taking over for drums would be John Hinch, but the vocalist that they would get in place of Al Adkins kind of happened as a result of romantic encounters between Ian Hill and one Sue Halford. They were dating, and Sue saw that Priest was struggling because Al left the band, so they needed a new vocalist. Sue recommended to Ian and the rest of the guys, how about my brother Rob? Can he join the band? And they were like, well, we need to hear him first. They heard him sing, and they thought, wow, this guy's great. Hell yeah, he's in the band. So Rob Halford joins Judas Priest in 1973, and then in 1974, at the beginning of 74, we would get a second guitarist, Glenn Tipton, who is actually the oldest member of the band right here. So this would end up being a blessing for not only Judas Priest, but heavy metal as a whole, because, you know, KK and Glenn together, two guitarists in one band. It was rare at this point to see bands with two guitarists. Like, you had Rolling Stones, Wishbone Ash, and Aerosmith up to this point. And hell, even Kiss. I'll throw in Kiss for good measure. So yeah, only a few bands had two guitarists up to this point. Judas Priest, however, truly pioneered twin harmonized lead guitar playing, or lead trade-offs, because with the other four bands I just brought up, they were almost like disassociated with each other, like just doing their own thing rather than playing riffs together or trading off leads. So KK and Glenn get all the credit, and rightfully so, for creating the twin guitar attack in heavy metal music forever. So this is the lineup we would get for now, and they would keep playing these local shows, and then in 1974 they would get signed to a small independent label called Gall Records, and they would go into the studio in the summer of 1974, and released September 6th, 1974, we would get Rocka Rolla, the debut album with, of course, the Coca-Cola ripoff album cover, which still to this day, I don't know how the band got away with this album cover, because it's a blatant ripoff of the Coca-Cola trademark. So how they didn't get sued over this is beyond me. But I digress. Now, as far as the ranking, I had this lower at one point on the list, but it actually went up a little bit. This is actually my number 13 album. I think for a debut, it's a pretty solid debut. Granted, it's not really a metal album. This was still rooted in, like, blues rock, hard rock, and even progressive rock. Like, there are prog rock touches all over this album. But for the most part, most of these songs are actually really fucking good. The opening track, One for the Road, that was kind of like prog rock meets blues rock to some extent. Because it was kind of slower, but you had these time shifts going on, and right away you can hear the potential in this band. The title track, Rocka Rolla, definitely feels like a 70s rock song. And then you get songs like Cheater, which is pretty cool. But the second half of this album, particularly not the instrumental Caviar and Meths, but the 3 tracks before in the second half, really make this album pretty solid. Never Satisfied, Run of the Mill, and Dying to Meet You. Never Satisfied, that kind of showcased a little bit of what Priest would become. Same with Dying to Meet You, but Run of the Mill was probably the big standout on this album for me, because it almost was like a prog rock tune for the most part, but it would get heavier towards the end, and they wrote this song in part to display Halford's overall vocal abilities. Like, you hear him at his lowest, and then you hear him do the wailing banshee screams. And of course, Halford, one of the greatest metal singers of all time, he's called the metal god for 2 reasons. One of the best voices in the genre, and then another reason we'll touch on a little bit later. But yeah, this is a solid debut. I do like this a lot more than some other albums we're going to be talking about after a bit. But still, this is a solid debut, even though it flopped because it only sold a few thousand copies. And actually, it was a pretty rough time for Priest at this point, because they were on the verge of starving to death and even asked Gall Records for a raise in their pay, but Gall, going through their own financial troubles, didn't honor that request. So basically the band just had to like work and like be with family just to be fed. So again, they paid their fucking dues, to say the least. But yeah, Rocka Rolla, my number 13 Judas Priest album. So after doing some light touring on the side, like playing local clubs once again, the band was truly trying their best to survive, but they managed to survive long enough to go into the studio towards the end of 1975, and we get another lineup shift as John Hinch would leave the band. Alan Moore would come back into the band to play drums on this next album, and one thing I forgot to mention with Rocka Rolla, it was produced by Roger Bain, who of course did the first 3 Black Sabbath albums, and did a solid job on that production, despite, not being like super heavy compared to Sabbath. Whereas for this next album, we would get co-producers Jeffrey Calvert and Max West, and released on September 23rd of 1976, once again on Gull Records, we would get Sad Wings of Destiny. This is my number 2 album. Again, I keep using this analogy. I keep using this quote. That quantum leap from debut to second album just like completely skyrocketed. Whereas Rocka Rolla was a pretty solid album, this is where Judas Priest became Judas Priest. Much heavier. You can definitely say this is a pure heavy metal album. And it definitely has just as much of a metallic sound as Sabbath or, other bands at this point in the mid-70s that were playing heavy music. And yet Judas Priest was really the first band to self-identify as being a heavy metal band, whereas Sabbath and others, we know Sabbath is the first heavy metal band, but they didn't self-identify as a heavy metal band at the time. Whereas Priest, they pretty much took that crown of being a heavy metal band. And this album, top to bottom, masterpiece. Like, it's like the perfect balance of like catchy riffs, almost like Jimi Hendrix coming down from the heavens in 1976 to lend his wisdom onto Judas Priest, with these awesome guitar solos, great riff writing, and great use of atmosphere. Like, you could say this is also kind of proto-progressive metal because of the different songwriting shifts going on the album. But you open right away with Victim of Changes, which is an amazing song, one of my all-time favorite Priest songs, especially that big giant scream at the very end. You get the Ripper, which is a fun, catchy, quickie tune. But then Dreamer Deceiver, one of the best Priest songs of all time. Both Dreamer Deceiver into the song Deceiver together, masterpiece. Absolute masterpiece. Definitely, you could say one of the first progressive metal songs. Like, I could definitely see how prog bands of the metal side would be inspired by that song. And also another great example of showcasing Halford's vocal range here in his lows and his highs. And this is actually one of my favorite sing-along songs, particularly the lower register stuff. But yeah, perfect tracks. Also songs like Tyrant, Genocide, and Island of Domination is such a great, catchy closer. And I love how it's kind of like sped up, and then you get a section where it feels kind of like Black Sabbath, where it gets a little bit more bluesy and a bit jammy. But top to bottom, absolutely brilliant. Production was great. They definitely took their time on this one and just crafted a perfect album. This is one of the best early heavy metal albums of all time, and it is my number 2. So, after Sad Wings of Destiny was released, they kind of, while it got great reviews amongst critics, they ended up kind of falling into obscurity because by this point in 1976, punk rock had taken over the UK, and if you were called heavy metal or hard rock in England during this time, you were seen as completely out of fashion or out of touch. So, Judas Priest ended up struggling a little bit more throughout much of the rest of '76 until, out of nowhere, they ended up getting resurrected by an album deal with Columbia Records over in America. So they ended up getting signed to a major label seemingly out of nowhere, which ended up being a huge, huge blessing for Judas Priest, because I think they're still with Columbia. Well, they were on different labels for a couple of albums later on, but I think they're still within the Columbia or Sony family for the most part. So bless them for picking up Priest just seemingly out of nowhere, but out of the goodness of their heart, I guess. So they ended up making the trip from the UK to the US, and they were just in awe of being over in America finally and getting to vacation and also stay there for a while, because now we get into the recording of the next album. However, Alan Moore would leave the band for good this time, but they needed a drummer for the recording of this next album, so they would get legendary session drummer Simon Phillips, who's mostly well known for his work in the band Asia, but has worked with a multitude of artists and bands, so on and so forth. So Simon Phillips comes in for the session drums, but for the tour, this was when they would end up picking up a pretty underrated legendary drummer in Les Binks. For the production for this next album, they would get bassist of Deep Purple, Roger Glover, to take over on the production. And they would enter the studio with Roger sometime in the beginning of 1977, and then released April 8th, 1977, we would get Sin After Sin. This is my number 5 album. This was a really good follow-up to a masterpiece of an album of Sad Wings of Destiny, and this album is amazing in its own right, just not quite as memorable to me as Sad Wings of Destiny, but it is still an incredible album, to say the very least. Like, top to bottom, every song absolutely kills. Opening with Sinner, which was a faster track, and then you get one of the greatest cover songs of all time when they covered Joan Baez's Diamonds and Rust. Other great songs like Starbreaker, and then you get to the song Let Us Pray, Call for the Priest, one of the earliest speed metal songs, because it's really fast for this time frame. And then you get to the final 2 tracks, which are vastly different. Here Come the Tears, which is an amazing yet somber ballad. And then you get to Dissident Aggressor, which was like this triplet heavy barn burner of a closer. And even Slayer agrees, as they would cover it years later. So, yeah, Sin After Sin. And the production on this album was, I thought, a little bit better than Sad Wings of Destiny, at least when it came to the drum sound. Roger Glover did a really good job when it came to the production on this album. So yeah, Sin After Sin, my number 5. Now, after Sin After Sin came out, they actually ended up getting a really cool supporting slot for REO Speedwagon in the States in a tour in 1977, which that had to have been really cool for Priest to get to open for a much bigger band at that point. But they would end up going into the studio once again towards the end of 1977, and this time when it came down to the production, we would get Dennis McKay as the producer for this next album, and released February 10th, 1978, we would get Stained Class. This is my number 4 album. Big, I would say, not really like a massive improvement, but a slight improvement over Sin After Sin, at least when it came down to memorable songs. The opening track, Exciter. This begins a bit of a theme, like bands named after Judas Priest songs. Of course, you had that Canadian speed metal band Exciter take the name from this song, and this song is another pillar track when it comes to the development of speed metal. but you also get other great tracks like White Heat, Red Hot, the title track, Invader, Saints in Hell. But my personal favorite off of this album would be Beyond the Realms of Death. This is another ballad, but also kind of another proto-progressive metal song because of the mood shifts and the different songwriting structures going on, but also unbelievably beautiful solos on this song. I mean, holy shit. This album, it's just another one of those masterful pieces of work when it comes to Judas Priest and metal as a whole. And I would dare say maybe the most underrated of the 70s catalog. I don't know, I feel like there's most of the other 70s albums, maybe aside from Rocka Rolla, could take that crown, but it all comes down to your interpretations. So, but yeah, Stained Class, my number 4. Now, they wouldn't be done in 1978 when it came down to recording and releasing music. They would actually, after doing a brief tour, go back to the studio in sometime in the summer of 1978 and released October 9th, October 9th, 1978, or, hiccups. Or here in the States, March 1st, 1979, under a different title, we would get Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather. This is my number 6 album. This, I feel, was kind of the transition for Judas Priest. Like, it still retained what some people would call smart songwriting from the previous 3 albums. Maintains that a little bit, but also kind of signaled where Judas Priest was going to go when it came down to writing more catchy songs and more hook-driven tracks or anthemic songs. This album, I feel, is like the perfect balance between the early stuff and what they would become on the next album. And also, it would be around this time, and also with Hellbent for Leather, the song, basically brings in the other reason why Rob Halford is considered the metal god, and that is creating the heavy metal outfit with the leather, chains, studs, and all that stuff, while not knowing that it was Rob expressing his homosexuality, because by the time he was in his mid-teens, he knew he was gay, so he needed to find some kind of outlet without saying anything about it to anyone else aside from the rest of the band members who knew about it for years and were supportive of him throughout the whole time. So he thought, I'm going to go to an S&M shop and I'm just going to buy the cap, the leather, studs, chains, whips, and nobody thought anything of it. They thought it was the most manliest thing in the world. And even on stage, whenever Halford would take the whips, they'll just whip people like, yeah, you want some more? And they would have badges made like, I've been whipped by Rob Halford. So, kind of odd looking back. But still, Halford gets credited with creating the heavy metal outfit. Eventually, when he would start wearing the jeans, and then eventually, like, you know, other bands would kind of adopt that look but add the cut-off jean jacket, there you had, like, the metal outfit forever. But yeah, as far as the songs on here, the opening track, Delivering the Goods, is a fantastic opener. Rock Forever is a fun, catchy tune. Of course, the song Hellbent for Leather, another one of those fast speed metal tracks. The title track, Killing Machine, and then you get another band named after Judas Priest songs, and that's Running Wild. So, Take on the World was another great anthem, but the difference between this and the US release, when it was titled Hellbent for Leather, and the only reason why the album got changed here in the States in 79 to Hellbent for Leather was because of some school shooting that happened in Cleveland or something like that, at least from what I can remember. So when it got delayed here in the States to March 1st, 79, they ended up adding a song for the US release, and that would be top 5 cover song of all time, Priest covering Fleetwood Mac's Green Manalishi. Such an amazing cover that doesn't sound like Fleetwood Mac at all. It sounds like as if Judas Priest wrote that song, which is a prime example of what a great cover song should be. So, yeah. So yeah, like I said, this album sort of acts like a balance between the early stuff and what they would become very quickly. But it is my number 6. So, it would be after the release of Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather that Priest decided, okay, we are making more money over here in the States, but we are still needing more stuff going our way. So they thought, okay, we need to start writing songs. So they would end up going to the studio at the very beginning of 1980 and would basically form a long-term relationship with a new producer, and that would be Tom Allom, who mostly is well known for being the engineer on early Black Sabbath albums and production for early Def Leppard. So he would come in and produce everything up to Ram It Down. And basically he produced all the 80s albums, I'll just say that. And released April 14th, 1980, we would get British Steel. Now this album is somewhat divisive, I guess, because you have like the fans, like Priest fans during this time, did not care for this album compared to what they heard prior, because Priest here, they definitely wanted to write more pop hooks and more anthemic tracks to kind of get some radio play, and also this would be the beginning of the MTV era of music, so they kind of wanted to have more of a broad mainstream appeal. So yeah, the older Priest fans don't really care for this album. I don't think anybody thinks any of those fans think this album's like bad or anything, just nothing compared to what they did before. But then you had fans of Priest that were getting into Priest at this point thought this album was absolutely incredible. I'm kind of a middleman. I don't think it's as good as the previous 4, but it's still a great album. I have it actually as my number 9. I can see where some people would be disappointed with this album because, you know, you had, like I said, the quote-unquote smart songwriting from Sad Wings of Destiny, Sin After Sin, and Stained Class. A little bit on Killing Machine, but you could definitely hear where they were going to go, but it was a good balance. This definitely felt more geared towards mainstream, but they still did it pretty well. The opening track, Rapid Fire, very fast, speedy track. Metal Gods is a really cool, fun one. Of course, you have songs like Grinder. The Rage, I think, is a particularly underrated song with an amazing bass line. Like, Ian Hill, I think, doesn't get enough credit for being a great bass player, because if you want proof he's a great bass player, listen to this song, The Rage. Absolutely fantastic. Now, I forgot to mention, actually, before I continue, that Les Binks would leave in '79 and in walks longtime drummer Dave Holland. I'm not going to get into him. If you want to know more about him, well, proceed with caution, because, yeah, there's some shit about him out there, and he passed away not too long ago, but, yeah. Let's just say it's very with Dave Holland. But he would come in on drums and did a great job. Now, of course, you have 2 big hits on here. Livin' After Midnight, which definitely felt like a true radio anthem song. It's still good, but Breaking the Law. Breaking the fucking Law. Even though this was like one of the most well-known Priest songs, it's still one of the best Priest songs. Like, it's catchy, but it's got balls to it. Absolute fucking balls. And of course, who hasn't done the Beavis and Butthead meme of the song, washing the dog, washing the dog? So, or even the Simpsons doing respecting the law, and all that crap. But British Steel, like I said, some people may have saw this as Jumping the Shark, but still kick-ass songs. But definitely in comparison to the previous 4, doesn't hold a candle to them. But it's still great, and it's my number 9. Now, moving on from there, The band would go back to the studio later in 1980 to work on the next album, and this next album would be released February 17th, 1981. We would get Point of Entry. Now, this album has always been kind of one of those weird albums for me. It's weird because this didn't really feel like a metal album compared to British Steel or even the previous four before British Steel. This definitely felt more like early 80s hard rock with metal touches. And for a long time, I had this album near the bottom, and it's still near the bottom. It's my number 16. However, going back through most of this album's better than I remember it to being, but it's still not that great. It's average at best. There are some good songs on here. Heading Out to the Highway is still a great opener. Desert Plains, I think, is a pretty underrated song. You Say Yes, All the Way, Troubleshooter. There are some good songs, but then you just get fucking garbage on here like Don't Go and especially Hot Rockin'. What in God's name were they thinking with that song? I'll never know. And that music video is so fucking odd. But yeah, this album ranks number 16 because, well, there's only a few songs I go back to on this album. And then, of course, the biggest problem, it's sandwiched in between greatness. And so this album does get passed over quite a bit. Whether it deserves it or not, that's up to you. For me, it's not a great album. It's not a good album. It's just an average album, I would say. But there are still some good songs you can go back to. But it ranks as my number 16. Now, moving on from there, Priest would end up touring all over the place and really begin their run of just amazing shows, amazing tours, as I just hit my knee off of the damn desk, and beginning their run of eventually headlining all over the world, becoming one of the biggest bands in the world. They would actually go back to the studio at the beginning of 1982 and released July 17th, 1982, we get a monumental album, Screaming for Vengeance. This is my number 3 album. One of the best metal albums of the 80s. No question. Top to bottom, perfection. The only complaint I really have about this album, the drum sound, like the snare drum. This begins a bit of a trend for the rest of the 80s albums where the snare drum goes up and down between sounding okay and then sounding like or processed. This began that, but aside from that minor gripe, the fucking songs were fantastic. Like the opening, like Iron Maiden at this point was already going strong, and they, along with Priest, started this trend of like intros into the opening tracks. And here, the Hellion Electric Eye, mwah, just mwah, spicy meatballs galore on that. Because the Hellion, 42 seconds, it's a brilliant interlude, but the true opener with Electric Eye, one of the greatest Judas Priest songs of all time. Fast, great double bass, even though the double bass isn't that audible. But it's a phenomenal track. Riding on the Wind with amazing vocal hooks. Bloodstone, Take These Chains. The title track, Screaming for Vengeance, which I think was, up to this point, the fastest song they've ever recorded and written up to this point. And it is hyper-aggressive. Even Fever, with its more kind of balladish tropes, was still really good. Devil's Child, a hell of a closer. But of course, the song that pretty much made Priest a household name for the rest of their lives, You've Got Another Thing Coming. Yeah, it might be one of the most overplayed songs of all time, but it's still a great song. There's a reason why it's played all the time, because it's great. And it's what pushed Priest to sell, like, Platinums Plus going forward. Like, I think this was the highest selling album of their career, and it was because of that song. And holy shit, it's still a great song regardless of how many times I've heard it. But top to bottom, this was like the right album at the right time, and it just really propelled things forward. This is my number 3. So, with the momentum pretty much in Judas Priest's court, the ball in their court, I should say, they just kept on chugging along, playing, headlining shows. Even in 1983, played the legendary US Festival with a multitude of bands, and I believe footage for this performance was eventually released on I think it was the 30-year anniversary edition of Screaming for Vengeance. I'm pretty sure of that, which I should get that version just so I could watch that US Festival performance if it's on there. But they would continue riding the wave of momentum, and heading into after playing shows, they would go to the studio later in 1983 and released January 4th, 1984, we would get Defenders of the Faith. This was another huge album for Priest in the 80s, and while it ranks as my number 7, it did fall just a tiny bit for me, but it's still a fantastic album. Granted, the production, I think, was kind of pushed up this time around. Like, I think Tom Allen might have gone a little overboard when it came to the production. Like, everything just sounds huge. And the snare drum, while a little better than Screaming for Vengeance, it still sounds a little bit kind of over the top, I guess, if I were to try and say anything. But the songs, again, kick ass. The opening, Free Will Burning, another fast ripper of a song, and probably one of the best songs to listen to while racing. Such an amazing track. Rock Hard, Ride Free, amazing as well. The Sentinel is another one of those fast rippers. Love Bites, Eat Me Alive, Some Heads Are Gonna Roll. Just top to bottom, not a poor wasted moment on here. This is just a great follow-up to a masterful album in Screaming for Vengeance. Just slightly not as good here, but still great, top to bottom, all things considered. And it is my number 7. Now, after Defenders of the Faith, we get into a slightly turbulent period in Judas Priest's history. By 1985, Rob Halford was really beginning to feel the pressures of isolating himself over his homosexuality, and turned to drugs and alcohol at this point, and it started to get completely excuse me, out of control for Halford, to the point where January 6, 1986, Halford, during the recording sessions of this next album, he had officially hit rock bottom, and he actually himself called 911 saying, "I need help." January 6, 1986, he enters rehab, and he's been clean ever since, which is quite the miracle, I must say. So he's been clean for nearly 40 long years. And it was great that he got clean, because now his voice just got better after he gave up drugs and alcohol. But going back to the recording sessions, once again, Tom Allen is the producer, and released April 14th, 1986, we get Turbo. Probably the most divisive album in the entire catalog, I would say, bar none, because it was around this point in the mid-80s, glam metal or hair metal, whatever you want to call it, was really the talk of the town at this point when it came down to mainstream rock. And there were established bands at this point that were kind of following that hair metal route, or adopting some aspect of it into their music to be relevant or to reinvent their careers. Priest was no exception to that. They ended up falling victim a little bit to the hair metal craze. And yeah, this album's my number 15. I do think it's a little bit better than some people give it credit for, because there are some legit, really good songs on here. the opening track, Turbo Lover, still one of the best Priest songs of all time, and it's just filled with a great lead, just cool drumming, even though, again, snare drum really sounding over the top, especially on here. But, and then also there would be the introduction of synthesizers into the band's sound at this point. But still, the band did a solid job, and I think out of all the established bands that kind of went the hair metal route, this is one of the better albums you're gonna hear. Like, I don't think it's as good as, say, like, Whitesnake's self-titled by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still an okay album, because there are some good songs. Turbo Lover, of course, locked in, like a 1-2 punch of really damn good songs, and even songs like Out in the Cold, Reckless was a great closer, but then you get tracks like Private Property and Parental Guidance, Wild Nights, Hot and Crazy Days, Hot for Love. Like, those songs, you can definitely tell they were following the hair metal trend on this album and just didn't really suit them. So yeah, it's about like almost half of the album's good, and because the other half of the songs I just brought up weren't so great, it propels the good songs, makes them even better, if you ask me. But still, not a bad album like so many people say it is. Like, I don't think Priest has a flat-out horrible album. Even the ones I'm going to have lower than Turbo, I think still have moments to them that I can go back to. But Turbo, I know my boy Kamikaze Games, if you're watching this, you're probably gonna want to kill me now because I'm ranking Turbo this low, but hey, it's just how I feel. But it's still okay. It's my number 15. Now, after Turbo came out, they did see a big modicum of success, mostly thanks to the song Turbo Lover, and getting radio play and music video on MTV, which, great music video with a nice hot chick on a bike. Was fucking cool. But they would ride the momentum from that and entered the studio in the latter portions of 1987 and released May 17th, 1988, we would get Ram It Down. This one's better than Turbo. This is my number 14, so we are moving up a little bit here. I do think it's better in terms of songs than Turbo. Like, I would say a better 1-2 punch here with the song Ram It Down and Heavy Metal. Those songs still are amazing on this album. And then you get some songs here that, again, just don't fit very well, like Love Zone and Come and Get It. But you do get some gems on here like Blood Red Sky, I'm a Rocker, Monsters of Rock. Arguably the doomiest thing in terms of tempo up to this point that Priest has done. And an okay cover of Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good, so there is that. But I think the biggest issue that I have with this album, and I'm sure there's going to be a ton of people that will agree with me about it, the drums. Dave Holland was still in the band at this point, but this sounded like a damn drum machine. Like, I feel like this was a flat-out drum machine performance. And unless you're an industrial metal band or Mortician, I do not like drum machines in my metal because, well, Typo Negative used drum machine, but they made it sound good, and I didn't mind it. So, unless there are exceptions with bands that use a drum machine, but Priest should not use a fucking drum machine. They've been gifted with great drummers. Why use a drum machine? So, yeah. That's the big issue I have with this album. But the songs were a bit better on here than Turbo, but it's still just okay. It's still just an okay album. And it is my number 14. Now, before we get into the next album, now we reach one of the darkest periods of Judas Priest. During a show they were playing in 1989, Priest was handed a subpoena because they found out they were being sued for the deaths of 2 young boys somewhere in Nevada in 1985. I forget the boys' names. I probably should have looked them up before I started. But I remember one of them was named James Vance. I just can't remember the other boy. But they entered a suicide pact and were listening to the album Stained Class and drinking, smoking pot, and ended up hearing the cover of Spooky Tube's Better By You, Better Than Me, which is a good cover. And because they were stoned and drunk off of their ass, they thought they heard a subliminal message in the song that said, "Do it," meaning kill yourself. And they thought they heard that message, and one of the boys took a shotgun, pulled the trigger, and died immediately. James Vance somehow survived, but died a couple of years later due to complications. And it was during his stay in the hospital bed, he wrote a letter saying that the music mesmerized them to believing the answer to life was death. And it led to the families of the two boys to sue Judas Priest over the deaths of the two kids. And of course, when Priest heard about this tragedy, they were like depressed. After all, it's a sad, sad story. But this begins, well, Ozzy Osbourne had something similar happen a little bit beforehand, but it was mainly this case right here that kind of really began a trend with metal and hard rock bands getting taken to court over stuff like this. And they would finally enter the court sometime in 1990 when the trial began, and I think they were in court for about a month at this point, and thankfully they were not held responsible for the deaths of the boys. And even the judge, you can tell there's like footage of the trial, and you can tell the judge was just wishing, could this be over? This is a waste of time and a waste of money. And the families, and this is where it gets into a bit of a rant, so I apologize for going on a tangent, but when families or people sue bands over the loss of their children, it's not the band or the music's fault. It's maybe your fault, parents, for not raising your kids properly. Plus, did they forget the boys were drunk and were high, so their judgment was impaired? You know? So what do you expect was going to happen when it came to them entering a suicide pact while drunk and high? So it's sad, and it's sad that the two boys died, but for the families to sue Priest over something that wasn't Priest's fault was just fucking ridiculous. And of course, like I said, it started a whole fucking trend, you know. Just do your research and look up at, like, who have been sued by parents over tragedies that weren't the fucking musician's fault. I hate these kind of people who do this to bands and artists and whatnot. But I digress. Now that I got that off my chest, let's get back to some good stuff. So, Priest would enter the studio at the very end of 1989, heading into 1990, and we would get a couple of changes. First, Dave Holland gone, and we would get the drummer who's been the drummer to this day, Scott Travis from Racer X, who's an American band. So, Scott Travis, the lone American in Judas Priest, at least for a little bit, and then he'll be back to being the only American later. But Scott Travis, I would say, while the previous drummers that Priest have had were great, Scott Travis plays with more sophistication and more aggression. And it definitely shows with this next album we're going to talk about. And then also, no longer production by Tom Allom, at least for a long time. In comes for the producer, Chris Sangarides, who, rest in peace, passed away 5 years ago. He worked with a multitude of bands, too many to mention in this video, and finally released September 3rd, 1990, we would get Painkiller. This, going into this, was my number one, and then coming out of this, it is still my number one. This is the pinnacle of Judas Priest, in my opinion. Oh my god. Up to this point, the heaviest thing they've ever fucking done. And I would still say the most aggressive album they've ever done as well. Like, this was just pretty much mostly flat out speed metal, or even thrash to some degree. Like, almost like as if Priest were maybe saying to the thrash bands, hold my beer. We'll show you how it's done. And while I don't necessarily agree with that, I do think bands like Megadeth, Slayer, and Metallica were doing a better job when it came to, like, thrashy stuff at this point. So it wasn't like Priest were saying, oh, we invented thrash. It was just, they were kind of maybe adapting to the times a little bit. Maybe they saw what was going on in the underground with the speed and thrash metal bands and thought, how about we incorporate a little bit of that into our sound but still be Judas Priest? And if that were the case, they did a great fucking job. I mean, right off the rip, the song Painkiller, that opening drum intro, you immediately hear the impact of Scott Travis. And then the guitar work on this album is flying. Halford's vocals, probably the best he has ever sounded vocally. Like, Painkiller, the song, pretty much, for the most part, is all high notes, except for a couple of lines. But one of the greatest metal songs of all time. And every other song on this album's absolutely incredible. Hell Patrol, All Guns Blazing, Leather Rebel, Metal Meltdown, Nightcrawler. Between the Hammer and the Anvil, I think, is a very underrated track. A Touch of Evil is really the one song on this album where they slow down. And this song, featuring synths, it was appropriate to kind of give it a darker tone. And it's one of the best slower Priest songs. And then the closer, One Shot at Glory, absolutely fantastic. Top to bottom, this is heavy fucking metal perfection. What more can I say about this album that hasn't been said already? So after Painkiller came out, they would go out on a tour with Bay Area thrash legends Testament opening up for them. However, during a show in 1991 on the tour, there was a bit of a crazy thing that happened. They were playing a show, and at the beginning, Halford's coming out on the bike, and he crashes violently into a half-raised drum riser, and he falls back off of the bike and was in some serious pain, but thankfully he powered through, showing that he was, despite his homosexuality, a man's man in terms of toughness. And he came back and performed the whole entire show despite in agony, delivered a killer set, and then immediately went to the hospital right afterwards. And that visit to the hospital made Halford kind of rethink himself a little bit. So then we entered 1992, where definitely another dark period comes for Priest, and that is Rob Halford decided to exit Judas Priest. Because Halford, he wanted to explore what was going on in the metal world at this point, so he went on to form a band called Fight, and did 2 albums with the band Fight. Scott Travis would actually come along with Fight, but still remain in Priest. So Scott would be the link between Halford and the rest of the band to kind of help make sure everybody stays in touch. And even Halford said himself, he was never intending to leave Priest forever. Like, he knew he wanted to come back at some point when the time was right. He just wanted to explore a little bit. However, Priest would end up being dormant for quite a few years. Like, I don't even think they toured for a long time. They were just kind of on a hiatus for a few years. But then they were craving to begin writing and recording music again, but they needed a new singer. So they were considering different possibilities until one night in 1996, Scott Travis happened to go to a show with a Priest tribute band called British Steel, and it was fronted by former Wintersbane vocalist Tim Ripper Owens from my home state of Ohio, Akron, baby. And Scott was at this British Steel show and saw them performing the Priest songs very well, but was absolutely floored when he heard Tim sing, almost exactly like Halford. Even the high notes, he hit just like Halford. And Scott actually ended up talking to Tim like, hey, we might be in touch about something in the future, buddy. And then Scott comes back over to England to talk to KK, Glenn, and Ian about, hey, what do you guys think about maybe getting this kid named Ripper to come and be our new singer? So they gave Tim a call to come over to England to do an audition. And Tim basically about shat his pants and ended up flying to England to enter the studio, a rehearsal studio, to audition for Priest, and they heard him sing a few takes, and KK, Glenn, Ian, and Scott looked at each other and were like, we found our guy to resurrect us. And so Tim Ripper Owens, lifelong Priest fan, becomes the new frontman of Judas Priest. And now we enter the Ripper Owens era of Priest, because right after Ripper gets the gig, they entered the studio sometime in early 1997, and they ended up getting dropped from Columbia Records for a while, so they would go over to SPV Steamhammer Records, which, again, if you are a fan of Sodom, that's the only label they've ever been on, so there you go. So they go over to Steamhammer SPV for these next couple of albums, and released October 16th, 1997, we get Jugulator. This was their first album in 7 years since Painkiller, and now the Ripper Owens era gets... I feel the Ripper Owens era gets a little bit of a bad rep, because I don't think there's anything like horrible during this period. In fact, Jugulator I have ranked as my number 10 Judas Priest album. In terms of, in my opinion, the most underrated Judas Priest album, look no further than fucking Jugulator, because up to this point, the heaviest album in Priest's catalog, like they were tuning lower to like, I think it was C sharp and even C standard. Like, they were getting pretty heavy on the guitars. They also brought in a little bit of a thrash and Pantera groove metal influence on here, and while some people think, oh dear God, that must sound dreadful, Priest actually did it pretty well. In terms of bands that were adopting the groove metal sound, Priest did it better than most. And fucking top to bottom, I loved this album. I don't see why people don't like it. I really, really love this album. It's aggressive, it's heavy. Ripper's vocals immediately make an impact. Like, he shows he's a phenomenal singer. Songs like the title track, Bloodstained, was a really nasty song. Burn in Hell, Brain Dead, Bullet Train. But the big song, the closer, up to this point the longest song of their career at over 9 minutes, Cathedral Spires. That's another one of my favorite sing-along tunes, because it's just... I love how it starts with that clean melody, but then it just gets into sinister fury and just punches you right in the dick. So, yeah, again, I don't get why people don't like this album. I think this is great. The most underrated Priest album, and it ranks as my number 10. Fucking awesome. So, after Jugulator came out, the band would go back on tour for a little while, and they wouldn't get back to the studio until 1999, and they ended up in the studio for quite a while. I think about a year and a half they were in the studio working on this next album. Once again on Steamhammer SPV. We would get released July 31st, 2001. We would get Demolition. Yeah, this album, definitely kind of similar to Turbo, is very divisive. I would say this arguably might be more divisive than Turbo. I don't know. Turbo still gets plenty of division, but Demolition, even though I have this ranked as my dead last, this is my number 18 album, I don't think it's as bad as some people say it is. Ugh, excuse me, hiccups again. Ugh. But there are some cringy fucking songs on here, like Jekyll and Hyde, Close to You, Feed on Me, and yeah, there are some cringy songs on here, but there are some great songs on here. Like the first 3 tracks, Machine Man, One on One, and Hell is Home, I think are great songs. I think some of the cringe factor comes in with some of the lyrics coming in on this album. And then also, there are a couple of nu metal-ish moments. Like, this was still during the time when nu metal was king of the world somehow. And I guess they wanted to adopt a little bit of that, but it's very faint. Like, I don't really hear that much nu metal on here. It's just only in, like, tiny increments on just a couple of songs. Other than that, most of this album, it still sounds like Judas Priest. It's just, yeah, some of the lyrics, not that great. But yeah, again, the first 3 tracks I think were good, were killer. Bloodsuckers, I think, is a very good track. Cyberface, one of the most sinister sounding Priest songs up to this point. I actually really dug the fuck out of that song. But yeah, the closer, Metal Messiah, that one definitely felt like a nu metal song, and I did not really care for it at all. So yeah, there are some great songs on here, but you do have some stinkers on here, but I don't think it's a bad album. I don't hate this album. I think it's just, in a similar case of Point of Entry, it's just average. And actually, this is the one Priest album I'm missing in the collection. I do plan to get it, because eventually I'm going to end up being a completionist anyways, so I'm going to end up getting it, even though I probably won't listen to the whole thing. If anything, I'll just go back to songs on here, because there are some really good songs on here. But as an album, dead last. Didn't quite hit the hammer on the nail for me. But after Demolition came out, they would tour for quite a while for the next couple of years. And meanwhile, what's Rob Halford been doing? Well, he had his band fight in the 90s. Then he had an industrial goth rock band called 2. And that's all I'm going to say. Not going to delve any further than I need to with that, because it wasn't good. And fans were clamoring for Halford to get back to his roots. And he eventually formed his solo band, Halford, and produced, or actually released, Resurrection, which I talked about last week in a CD collection update. And it was a resurrection of the metal god. And because of that, there would be Priest fans who were just begging and pleading for Halford to come back to Priest. And Ripper even kind of saw the fan uproar about getting Halford back in the band, and was very gracious about it, and even talked to Halford, and Ripper said that Halford was always good to Tim. So Ripper decided, yeah, I think the time is right for the metal god to come back, so he would bow out and let the metal god take his rightful place back on the throne of heavy metal. And in 2003, Halford returned to Priest to much praise amongst metal fans and Priest fans alike. And after Halford came back, they would end up going back to Columbia Records, who are now Sony Music. So they're back on a major label with Halford back into the band. And they decided, you know what? Let's get back into the studio and do some new songs. So here they would actually work with the same producer of the Halford albums, Roy Z, to come in as the producer for this next album. And released February 28th, 2005, we would get Angel of Retribution. This is my number 11 album. In terms of a comeback album, this is definitely a good comeback album. Like, the songs were very strong on here. It's just, when it comes to comebacks from classic bands, I don't think it's as good as, say, Iron Maiden's Brave New World, or crucify me for saying this if you want, or even Metallica Death Magnetic. Like, I don't think it quite holds a candle to those two albums, but it's still really fucking good. It's still really fucking good. The opening few songs, Judas Rising, Deal with the Devil, and Revolution, 1, 2, 3 powerhouse punches. And even top to bottom, every song is really good. And then you get to the final 3 songs. where most of the album was in standard tuning. The final 3 tracks they tuned down to E flat to give it a more sinister sound. But then you get the longest song in Priest's career, the closer, Loch Ness, 13.5 minutes, and it's a brilliant closer. Unbelievable song with great vocals, great guitar work, just mwah. Kind of like the perfect kiss, or sealed with a kiss kind of moment for a comeback. It's still a really good album, but when it comes to comebacks, it's not the strongest comeback album there is out there. At least in my opinion. But it does rank as my number 11. So Priest would end up touring a whole lot on Angel of Retribution, and much to the fans' liking because they hadn't toured with Halford for a long time. But then they would go back to the studio in 2007, and they had a different idea in mind for this next album. They wanted to experiment a little bit and do a double album, and their first concept album all about the infamous prophet and astrologer Nostradamus, because they were fascinated by the ideas around Nostradamus, his human psyche, and what he says with his prophecies and stuff like that. Whether you believe in that stuff or not, you know, it's out there. And they ended up wanting to adopt that as the concept for this next album. However, they would do it in 2 parts. The first album would focus on some of the prophetic nature of Nostradamus, while the second disc would focus more on his personality and emotional side. And finally released June 16th, 2008, we would get Nostradamus. This is another one of those very divisive albums. I know, and I'm recording this before the Thralls guys are recording their Priest ranking. Kind of funny, we had close to the same date with Immolation and now Priest when it came to rankings. But I know Joe Shredlord has that album dead last. This, call me nuts, I have this as my number 12. Granted, it is super fucking bloated. This is the longest album of their career. This is like over 90 minutes, which is overkill for this kind of a concept. But the reason I have it at number 12 is because there are legit great fucking songs on here. Like, you know, the openers, Dawn of Creation into Prophecy was a phenomenal opener for me. Even Four Horsemen into War, while no real guitars present, it's a fun, like, ambient song. But Sands of Time, Pestilence, and Plague back-to-back was great. But I would say my personal favorite song across this whole double album experiment, actually, I'll get to that afterwards. And then the second disc, I didn't care for a lot of the songs until we get to the end with the title track and Future of Mankind. Like, hell, if it were up to me, if I was going to construct this album, I would have had, I would say, not counting the interludes, I would have done the songs Prophecy, Revelations, War, Pestilence and Plague, Conquest, the title track, and Future of Mankind, and one more song that I think was the big hidden gem off of this album, and probably the most underrated Judas Priest song ever, the song Death. That is Judas Priest at their doomiest. Unexpectedly created one of my favorite doom metal songs of all time. Feels like entirely paying homage to Black Sabbath, because it's similar to the song Black Sabbath with the riffing, but oh my god, it's such a powerful, bombastic doom song with a triplet swing at the end with great leads. And again, the leads on this album are fantastic. I think the problems, if you ask me, the problems I hear a lot of people have with this album is, of course, I agree, it is long, and it didn't need to be that long. Like I said, if they would have just cut the album to those songs, I think this would have been a great album. But, yeah, that's one big criticism. Another criticism, the production isn't the best, but it's not the worst. And then, of course, also, I would say, yeah, some people think the concept was overplayed by this point, or overdone at this point with Nostradamus, but Priest did it in an interesting way. And then, I have heard some people say this, but the biggest reason I think people don't like this album is because fans wished Iron Maiden did this album and not Judas Priest. So, at least that's just from what I've seen on, like, forums and shit like that, or YouTube comments. But, yeah, it ranks as my number 12. Granted, yeah, like, chunk of this album I don't care for, but the songs that I love, I still go back to from time to time. There are some legit great songs on here, but it does rank lower because of everything I brought up. But after that, they would be touring for quite a while, actually. They toured for the next few years. And then we get into 2011, where we get another turbulent moment in Priest's career, as there were all these rumors coming out and about Judas Priest retiring. But it ended up being K.K. Downing leaving the band, thinking that, yeah, we should hang it up. But the rest of the guys, they didn't want to hang it up. They wanted to keep going, but KK decided to hang it up, at least until KK's Priest formed just a couple of years ago. But everybody else wanted to keep going, so KK bowed out. One of the only two original members up to this point, leaving only Ian Hill, the only original member from the very beginning to now. But in KK's place would be former session guitarist for Christopher Lee. Richie Faulkner would come in to take over on second guitars and is still in the band to this day. And he's an awesome player, and he actually kind of looks like a young KK Downing a little bit, so he fit that role perfectly. So he would come in as the new guitarist, and they would finally get back into the studio in 2013, and released July 8th, 2014, we would get Redeemer of Souls. I actually reviewed this album, I think, when it came out in 2014, and I liked it more back then, but now this album hasn't really aged for me that well. This is my second to last. This is my number 17. The songwriting was very scattershot on this album looking back, but there are some really good ones on here too, like Dragonaut, Halls of Valhalla, Metalizer, and even some of the bonus tracks on the 2-disc version are better than most of the main album songs. But the biggest problem I have with this album, the production. What the fuck? Yeah, the production on this album was not that good. It sounded really thin, and the drums, oh my god, they just, you could barely hear the guitars when the drums were just always going. So yeah, it's just uneven production, thin production for 2014. Yeah. That shit don't fly with me when it comes to Priest, like, yeah. So yeah, mainly because of the scattershot songwriting and the uneven production and thin mix, yeah, this album definitely ranks as my number 17. But they would go back to touring once again, and then they would enter the studio in 2017 to work on this next album and rekindle an old relationship and begin a new one. They would rekindle their relationship with their old producer, Tom Allom. He would actually come back to be a co-producer, and then the other co-producer would be the one and only Andy Sneap from Sabbath and other bands that he performed, and producer for so many amazing bands. So we would get this co-production between Tom Allom and Andy Sneap, and released March 9th, 2018, we get the latest album, Firepower. This is my number 8. I think this is a true comeback album. I think it's better than Angel of Retribution, and a hell of a comeback after a rather meh album with Redeemer of Souls. And I actually reviewed this one too when it came out in 2018. And I remembered being blown away, and it's still incredible. Top to bottom, every song is killer. Lots of different touches of their career. Like, you get a couple of songs that kind of go back to the 70s period, like particularly the interlude Guardians into Rising from Ruins. That almost feels like it could have been on something like Stained Class or something. But then you get some killer tracks that could have been on Painkiller, like Lightning Strike, which is one of my favorite singles. And then even the song Lone Wolf, kind of touching back on the Jugulator era a little bit, except this is Halford's vocals. But yeah, just brilliant comeback top to bottom with an awesome fucking album cover. Like, holy fucking shit. Now, of course, I have to address it, of course, with Andy Sneap. I know there's been a lot of people... Andy Sneap has become one of the most divisive producers in metal history. Like, you have people who absolutely love his production, and then you have people who are just sick of it, because it is a bit universal across the board with bands that he works with. Like, he'll occasionally turn some knobs and such, but I don't give a shit. It sounds amazing. Every band he touches, he makes everybody sound awesome. And it doesn't sound overproduced. It sounds well and organic. And this album is no exception. This is one of my favorite productions of Andy Sneap. And just, holy fucking shit, this album's fantastic. And it is my number 8. Now, after Firepower did come out, Glenn Tipton ended up getting diagnosed with Parkinson's, so he wouldn't be able to tour, so Andy Sneap would actually take over his place on tours, so just to protect Glenn. So Glenn's still in the band, but just now on a more studio basis. And yeah, that's pretty much it with Priest, and as of recording this, I actually haven't checked it out yet, but they did release a new single for their next album that will be coming out, which the album covers up here, called Invincible Shield, which is set to come out in 2024, and I can't fucking wait for that album. So immediately I got the most anticipated album of 2024 right there with Judas Priest. That's probably going to be killer. So yeah, we're all coming out of this video, we're getting hyped for more Priest coming here in the next several months. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for my ranking of all things Judas Priest. Before I wrap it up, the legacy of Judas Priest, and finally they got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this year in 2023. Granted, through like a lifetime achievement thing, but they are in when they should have been in years ago. Like at the early 2000s they should have went in, but better late than never. But Priest sold a bunch of records, especially in their big period in the 80s, and started in 1969, a year after Black Sabbath, and in the same town of Birmingham, England, and have proven to be one of the most important and influential bands in not just metal, but all of music. And without Priest, who knows what would have happened in music, let alone metal. After all, everybody, the main guys that have been in the band for a long time or were there forever, Ian, Glenn, KK, Halford, Scott Travis, you guys all rule. The metal god, fucking, the day he passes is going to be one of the saddest days ever, but when he does leave us behind, may the gates of heaven open and he can hang out with Dio and Lemmy. Amen. But anyways, so that will wrap this up. Now, as far as what's coming up, I have a little surprise for you guys. I posted about this on the community tab on my YouTube page when I posted my November schedule. There's going to be a special surprise ranking coming on Thanksgiving Day. Originally, I was just going to wait until the holiday season for the next band I was going to talk about, Edge of Sanity, in December, which is still going to happen. But for November, on Thanksgiving Day, I decided to add an extra ranking because I made a massive fuck up. So over on the community tab, the polls I got for the bands you would like to see me rank for 2024, I had one poll for death metal, and I forgot to put in one particular band, and I realized, fucking shit, I gotta start giving this band more respect. So the next band I'm gonna be talking, Thanksgiving Day, I'm gonna be talking Bolt Thrower, which that is going to be exciting because no bad albums, but it's going to be interesting to rank. But anyways, that will come Thanksgiving Day. But until Turkey Day comes around for that, you metalheads out there, keep your horns high and your dreams wet.